Okay, good morning. This is a lecture on the French and Indian War and the crisis this precipitated. We're gonna cover the war itself, so I'll wait a second here until the slideshow works a bit. Oh dear. Okay, so that works. This is all we're going to cover: the war itself, the results of the war, the plan for peace, the line the British drew, and how this led to conflict. So, without further ado, we'll jump into the French and Indian War, which is technically called the 7 Years' War, but I really call it World War I, because it was fought all over the world between the interests of the British and the French. And the war went badly for the first couple of years in North America for the Americans and the British. It was started in 1754 by the desire of Virginia settlers to acquire land in the Ohio Valley, to sell it, survey it, and make it part of the British colonies. Well, both General George Washington, who was not a general at the time, but was a young man, and British General Braddock were repelled by the Indians and the French. They were massacred. And so it spread around the world and became this 7 Years' War. The Native Americans were on the frontier against the colonists from this moment till 1815. There really was no real end to the violence on the frontier and the difficulty that the colonists had in mollifying the Indians. So, the war went badly for the colonists and the British, as you can kind of see on this map by the number of French victories in the heartland here. William Pitt became Prime Minister of England in 1757. He said famously that he believed that "I can save England, and only I can save England," he famously said. What his policy was to go into massive debt, to fund the war himself by taxing the British exorbitantly, by giving money to his Prussian allies, his German allies, to try to hold off the French and the Austrians and the Russians. Good luck. And put the emphasis from England into winning the war in the colonies, to put the regular British Army into North America. And that strategy worked. They took Quebec and Montreal in 1759 and 1760, and effectively kicked the French out of North America. That was the result of the war. And Frederick the Great was able to rally the Prussians. They held on the mainland of Europe. So the Treaty of Paris was called. It took a long time to negotiate, but basically that, as you see on this map, kicked the French out of North America. They retained possession of a couple of sugar islands and French fishing rights off the coast of Nova Scotia, but the British gained all the land north and east of the Mississippi River. The allies of the French, the Spanish, kept western Mississippi, and the Native Americans were not there. They were not asked what their interests were or what the land settlement ought to be. They were just not consulted. So they went on the warpath, basically. They rose up in what became known as Pontiac's Rebellion in the eyes of the English in 1763. So King George III, a young king, he's only 3 years on the throne, issued the proclamation line of 1763 along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. See, the British government feared the expense of ongoing wars with Native Americans. Pontiac's Rebellion was very difficult and very costly to try to put down. So they proposed a number of forts along the crest of the Appalachians to be manned by regular British Army troops. Basically, the British didn't trust the American colonists to police the frontier line themselves. They thought they would be too ready to steal Indian land. And so they thought they should have British regular troops in the forts, and that Americans ought to be required to pay for these troops. They certainly were in the interests of the Americans. And don't forget, it was the Americans that had started the war that got the British into this big debt. So that all the taxes that ensued, all the revenue-raising schemes that the British enacted for the next 12 years, all were based on this need to fund soldiers on the frontier line to keep the Americans from stealing Indian land. And that's basically what happened to lead the British to try to tax the Americans so much. So here you see a visual of the line and the forts and the fact that they were going to be expensive to maintain. Now, the British were paying for all this, and they were very heavily taxed. They were taxed at a rate at least 5 times, as much as 26 times the rate of the Americans, so that the Stamp Act and other acts were going to make this much more expensive, but not anywhere near what the British people were used to paying in taxes. Okay, so that's the short-term impacts of the French and Indian War on England and the 13 colonies were obviously that it caused a bit of tension. Okay, thanks for this.